The book of Genesis is the first book in the Bible and the first book in the Torah. Its title means beginning or origins and derives from the Greek translation of the Bible, or the Septuagint. Who was the author? We don't really know who wrote it, but it is believed to have been composed about the time period of Moses, around the 13th century BC. Several stories are very similar to the stories of the nations that surrounded Israel during this time period. However, the theology of the biblical stories is often quite different than that of Israel's neighbors. Content. Genesis is made up of 50 chapters and is divided into two parts. The first part, the primeval narratives and traditions, makes up chapters 1 through 11 and contains narratives about the world out of which Israel's ancestor Abraham came to follow God's call. It looks back at the universal setting of the birth of the nation of Israel. The second part, the patriarchal narratives and traditions, makes up chapters 12 through 50 and contains the stories of Israel's great ancestors, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are two different creation accounts in the book of Genesis. The first account, chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verse 4a, is a summary description of the creation of the world and everything in it. This account may be called a theocentric account because God and his majestic work of creation is its primary focus. The second account, chapter 2 verse 4b through verse 25, is a more specific treatment of the making of man, the animals, the woman, and the divine assignments of work to the man in the garden. It is an anthropocentric account in which the emphasis is on humanity's nature, destiny, and vocation. The creation stories have confused people since ancient times. In this episode, we will be focusing on the first creation account. The first creation story in Genesis 1 is told in the literary format of exalted prose. But where did it come from? Some scholars say that Genesis 1 originated with the priestly source, or the P source. Evidence for this includes the emphasis placed on the Sabbath day of rest, and the fact that the story contains a list and numbers. Other scholars say that it came from the Yoistic source, or the J source, and the evidence they give is that it is very poetic and written in a highly elegant style. However, more and more evidence seems to indicate that Genesis 1 has its origins in some other completely different source, someone we know little to nothing about. Some evidence for this is the uniqueness of the story itself, and also the simple fact that this passage is so difficult to categorize. So let's dive in and take a look at the different themes of this passage, shall we? Creatio ex nihilo. Creatio ex nihilo refers to creation out of nothing. Most of the other ancient Near Eastern creationists are about gods who created the universe and the earth out of material that already existed. Genesis 1 gives the impression that God caused all that exists to exist in the first place. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul describes Abraham as one who believed in the God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. The creator of heavens and earth. The focus of the first creation story is on the creator and what the creator made. The book of Genesis opens with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This establishes the theme of the story, God is creator. God is creator of both the physical and the spiritual realms. Light and darkness. Genesis 1 describes the earth after it has been created as being a chaotic, dark, watery mass without any shape or form. God's spirit enters into this creation to investigate it and decides to begin bringing order to this chaos. God commands that there be light, and then he separates light from darkness. Here, a distinction is being made between good and evil. What's in a name? God names the light day and the darkness night. In other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, the deities also named their creation. This shows that the deity not only creates, but has authority over the creation. A creation that has been given a name is a creation with value and purpose. God is described as examining his own creation to see if it is good or not. He decides that it's good. Days and seasons. After this, the text says that there was evening and there was morning, the first day. But wait a minute, how can there be evening and morning without the sun, moon, and stars? Well, we do need to remember that this is a prose poem, and literature throughout all of history uses the images of morning and evening as symbols of the beginning and the end of a season or time period. The waters. The text then says that God created some sort of expanse in order to separate different kinds of waters from each other. In other words, the physical realm now consists of more than just the waters of chaos. God is bringing further order to his creation. After separating water from water, God again exercises his authority over his creation by naming his creations sea and sky. At the end of the day, God examines his creation again, decides that what he has made is good, and evening and morning are mentioned again. The creative creation. On the third day, God separates water from land. The text indicates that God gives the land the ability to produce life, in this case, plant life. At the end of the third day, God examines his creation again and decides that it's good. So, at the end of the first 3 days, God has gone about separating the physical from the spiritual, good from evil, and various elements of the physical realm. At this point, the narrative describes in greater detail the creations within the creations of the first 3 days. The first 3 days of creation correspond to the last 3 days. On day 1, we see the separation of light and darkness, and on day 4, we see the filling of light and darkness with the sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, we see the separation of sky and water, and on day 5, we see the filling of the sky and water with birds and creatures. On day 3, we see the separation of water from land and plant life, and on day 6, we see the filling of the land with animals and people. So these are then creations within creations, but does that mean that these are also days within days? And what does that even mean? The creations of the first 3 days are incomplete without the creations of the last 3 days. These different creations were made to exist together. So what do we actually mean when we say that these could be days within days? Well, the creation story of Genesis 1 can be seen as a bit like a play, with 2 acts providing 2 different perspectives on the same event, and 3 scenes for each act with different perspectives on the same thing. In the epilogue to this play, God rests. But first, here's what happens in the climax. God creates the sun, moon, and stars on day 4. In the text, God says that these heavenly bodies will serve as measurements of time and seasons. Within the framework of the creation of light and darkness is seen the creation of both the physical elements of space, including sun, moon, and stars, but also that which these things signify, time. On day 5, the water and sky are filled with fish and birds, but the text is building up to the creation of mankind. Mankind is the pinnacle of God's physical creation. Also, the text says that God causes living things to grow out of the ground. He gives his creative capacity to nature itself to create. First, plant life, second, animal life, and finally, human life. Humans are God's final creation. The text says that God creates humans in his image and likeness. But what does that mean? Well, humans are given authority over creation, just as God has authority over creation. Humans are given intellect, just as God has intellect. Humans have the ability to create, just as God creates. Humans are given a spirit, just as God is spirit. Humans have the ability to exist as both body and spirit, which God is also capable of. Humans are given the ability to distinguish between the physical and the spiritual, like God. And humans are created to be perfect, just as God is perfect. Yet, while humans share all of these things with God, they are still subject to their Creator. Humans were created to represent God, but they were not created to be God. Male and female. Genesis 1 gives equal status to both men and women, saying that they are both made in the image and likeness of God, and are made to fulfill the same tasks in the created order. So God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Epilogue. On the 7th day, God rests from creating things. He sits back and admires his creation, and proclaims it all to be good. The 7th day is the day of completion, or perfection. Qualitative versus quantitative. The use of numbers in ancient texts was often used to determine quality rather than quantity. This means that numbers were used because they held some symbolic value to the author. The number 7 is often associated with perfection or divine completion, and the number 7 and numbers divisible by 7 are all over the place in Genesis 1. Chapter 1 verse 1 consists of 7 words, chapter 1 verse 2 consists of 14 words, and then chapter 2 verses 1 through 3 has 35 words, or 5 times 7. Elohim is mentioned 35 times in this passage, also 5 times 7. Heaven, or firmament, and earth are each mentioned 21 times, and the phrases "and it was so" and "God saw that it was good" each occur 7 times. And finally, we come to the end of this first creation story, where God charges humanity with the task of being creative. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground."